Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This video will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films of this chosen year. This year in discussion is the year 2014 and it's a good one. So let's get started. Before we get into our top 5, let's get into the Honourable Mentions for this year, and there's a lot of them. American Sniper, Edge of Tomorrow, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, Nightcrawler, The Equalizer, The Theory of Everything, Unbroken, John Wick, Captain America the Winter Soldier, Ex Machina, It Follows, The Imitation Game, and Fury. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. Kingsman: The Secret Service is directed by Matthew Vaughn and stars Taron Egerton, Colin Firth, and Samuel L. Jackson. Now, we're starting off this year's video with a strong entry, and that's Kingsman: The Secret Service. Now, bit of context, of course, because the Kingsman after this movie became a franchise. We've had The Golden Circle, which was fine, but not too memorable, not a movie I love in any way. Then we had The King's Man, the prequel, which was not very good, in truth. As much as I like Ralph Fiennes, that movie was not a lot to love. However, the first film, the introduction to the Kingsman series, characters, idea, is a brilliant spy comedy. It's probably the best subgenre to place it into. Because Kingsman, and I used to say this for years, and admittedly it changed a little bit when I rewatched Casino Royale. And I love Casino Royale. But I did always used to say that I actually enjoyed this more than any James Bond film. Now again, as I say, that's changed when I rewatched Casino Royale and kind of remembered how much I love that, and that does take superiority for that in my spy ranking films, if that's even a thing. But this film, there's something about the action, the comedic moments, the chemistry and the charisma that's on show, and the best place to start with that is absolutely Taron Egerton. Now obviously, now we know him for things like his Elton John performance in Rocket Man and a handful of other stuff, but I still think there's not been a better performance in a spy film than this. Because even in something like Casino Royale, yes, Daniel Craig's great, and I don't want to keep making that comparison because they are ultimately different films. One's a spy comedy, one's a very serious spy film. But if we're just talking about kind of undercover missions and that kind of film, I think that Taron Egerton as Eggsy is one of my favourite characters just in kind of the last decade. He's so easy to root for. He has that normality. He's very grounded as a character. He doesn't grow up with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's actually the complete opposite. He is basically very much down on his luck, very much a very normal person. And I suppose that's when we talk about the surrogacy and the lens that we view this world through as an audience, and then through the main character, it's brilliantly captivated by him in this. And then of course in the wiser character, the kind of father figure, the Obi-Wan to the Luke Skywalker, the Gandalf to Frodo in Colin Firth to Taron Egerton in this, there's something about the dynamic between them two One's a true gentleman, one is a working class teenager, essentially. But the dynamic, when you get a film and you just know they've struck gold. That was, I really, I went back and watched this not too long ago, and it was actually after I'd seen the other films. And to be honest, that was kind of the biggest thing for me. When I look back at it, I still love the first film. And that's a testament to it, because we have talked, and we've talked so many times on 5 of the Best about, sequelitis, and actually the harm that a bad sequel can do to a great, introductory film. And while the sequels, as I've said, have been to varying success, the second film was just fine, and the prequel was not very good, in my opinion. I just still think Kingsman: The Secret Service, as a one-off film, as I treat it now, I know they were talking about making possibly further entries in the series, but I'd be happy if this was the only one we got. Just a one-off, enjoyable spy comedy with some brilliant moments, brilliant performance. People like Samuel L. Jackson, who at this point of his career, even at that point, which would have been, 8-9 years ago, he could have just, came in, did a half-par job, and got a big paycheck. But no, he does a great outing as the villain. Michael Caine is in here and also gives a surprisingly good performance. And surprisingly, there wasn't any of these larger actors that would have been maybe the selling point, even with Colin Firth. It's clear that they believed in the project, and that comes across from the minute one. And as I say, whenever I seen this film, and I was about halfway through, probably the first act even, I remember thinking to myself, if they can keep pace with this, and pacing is another thing I want to get onto, but if they keep pace and keep as good and as strong as the first act is throughout the film, we're onto a real winner here. And they do. There isn't a part when this film drops. And I mentioned there about pacing in general. The pacing of this film, there's never a part when you're checked out. It's always engaging. The threats and the mission that the characters are on, this kind of journey of self-discovery that Taron Egerton's character, Eggsy, is on, But let's talk about another bit that I really love, and that's the action. And I actually think the action scenes in this are one of the more memorable in the last, I would say, even 20 years. Because, the best example is that, the church scene, the kind of, not to talk too much about it, but it involved Colin Firth. There's a lot of action, let's put it that way. And it's shot as Leonard Skinner's Free Bird. There is such a memorability to that scene, and that's one that always sticks in my head when I think of this movie, as I'm sure it probably does with yourself if you enjoy the film and remember the film. But overall, there isn't a lot that Kingsman does wrong in this first film, and I suppose that's my biggest gripe with the other two. Maybe I go in hoping to get the same magic that the first film had, and they sadly weren't able to recapture that. Of course, the second film and the sequel wasn't as bad as the prequel, but it still wasn't anywhere near the quality of this. Kingsman: The Secret Service is such an enjoyable film. I think if you enjoy any kind of action comedies, spy films, if you enjoy your James Bond and you want kind of a new palette of the same kind of scenario, there's so much to love here. So much to love. I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that doesn't find enjoyment in this first film of Kingsman. Maybe just think twice before watching it as a franchise as a whole, watching all 3 films. I am optimistic if they are going to make a third that they can maybe recapture some of the magic and maybe more than the other 2 films did. But no matter what happens with all that, I still love Kingsman: The Secret Service. Number 4. Gone Girl is directed by David Fincher and stars Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike. Now, strangely, for Gone Girl, the biggest recommendation for this film actually came from my mother. It was because she had read the book and she said that is a wonderful story. If they can do it right in a movie, then they will be, it can really be a contender for one of the movies of the year. So I went in with that. I didn't get seeing it with her. I went with friends at the time, and I remember coming out of Gone Girl thinking it's one of the better murder mysteries. It's not really a murder mystery. How would you describe Gone Girl? kind of an investigation movie. And I suppose the director in David Fincher is probably one of the most apt directors for that. After directing things like Seven, which is of course one of the great films of the 90s, Zodiac, which is an underrated film, I would say, that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. And to have him in this directorial role in an investigation about a wife that goes missing, and all the challenges, all the question marks that you as the audience go alongside, he directs this wonderfully. I mean, saying David Fincher is a good director is like saying water is wet, so there's no point even, and especially in this genre, as I say, this kind of niche, this is right up his street. But for the main two leads in this, in Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike, I have to be honest, even way back to Good Will Hunting, I'm not, and I haven't been the biggest Ben Affleck fan. I have to be honest. Not that I don't enjoy his performances, but I don't think I've ever been blown away by a performance by his. And to be honest, I actually don't know if I was blown away by him in Gone Girl, but he certainly is the best part of this film when it comes to performance-wise. Because of course Rosamund Pike is the, what would you say, like the, you know, the reason the whole story happens. She is the catalyst for everything that happens, and every scenario that's played out is because of her. But actually, in the story, yes, she's great, and it's probably my favourite. I mean, I'm not too familiar with a lot of her work, in truth. I mean, I remember her in things like The World's End not too long ago before this, but it would be my favourite performance of hers. But she is more out of the picture for a lot of this film, and it's more focused on Ben Affleck's lack of awareness is probably the most, layman's terms way of describing this. It's a missing poster for his wife, and he's with a big smile beside it. There's that lack of self-awareness, but he does play that really well. And to be honest, a bit like what I touched on there, I don't know that I thought that Ben Affleck had a performance like this in him. And the dynamic between Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike as the husband and wife, this very dysfunctional husband and wife. But as a movie overall, I can see why the book was so loved and so adored and such a bestseller that it was before this. And I would imagine with the film being great, that the book sales also skyrocketed from that. I actually never went back to my mum and asked, is it an apt, adaptation? Is the movie as good as the book? Because there's very rarely you find that. Of course, that's a narrative for so many things. For larger fantasy series or even smaller niche films that have been adaptations of books. Sometimes you find that there's I can't think of too many where the movie adaptation is fully true to the novelization. But regardless, Gone Girl it's an awesome film. It's so enjoyable. It's one of those films that I think I've said this before on the series, where it takes you on a ride with the characters. You never feel ahead of the story. And I love that in good storytelling like these, where you always feel, you're always trying to work it out as the movie goes. You're trying to solve the mystery with the police or with the main character or and I feel if that's done well and that's actually executed well, a bit like and as we mentioned the film there with David Fincher in Seven. Certainly this film isn't as sinister as Seven is, but it is that kind of, I want to work this out before the characters do, and that's such an enjoyable experience as an audience member. Well, it is to me, certainly, and I would imagine it applies to you yourself as well, where you never want to be ahead of the story, of course, but you want to feel like you are. And I think a good director and a good script encapsulates that so well. And I suppose that probably comes from reading a book and trying to work it out. And while it isn't really a murder mystery per se, it does have that kind of feel where you're always trying to work it out, always trying to be one step ahead. And that's why Gone Girl is just such an enjoyable... It was an enjoyable movie experience. On rewatches, it's actually really good as well, but I would say it's most enjoyable when you forgot about it after seeing it, if that makes sense. Because obviously this came out in 2014. I seen it then, and I loved it. But then I knew it wasn't a film, I would watch it and then give it a month and then buy it and then watch it again, because you wouldn't enjoy it as much, because of course the joy is the trying to figure it out. But a few years later, I think it was like 2017, 2018, I went back and rewatched it, and I forgot the majority of the movie. I just remembered enjoying it, and that was a really good experience, because I remember going, or I remember feeling what I felt the first time I seen it in the cinema, and that was a really enjoyable. Yeah, Gone Girl's just really good, and it's one of the better ones of this kind of subgenre that it's in. You know, this kind of mystery to find an X scenario. Gone Girl's awesome. It's an awesome film, and it's so worthy of being on the top 5 for this year in a very stacked year.
Number 3.
Guardians of the Galaxy is directed by James Gunn and stars Chris Pratt, Zoe Saldana, Bradley Cooper, Vin Diesel, and Dave Bautista. Now, Guardians of the Galaxy. Where do I start with this one? Because of course we've come so far in Marvel now, and even whenever this was released, we had already been quite a far bit into the Infinity Saga journey. We had already had the first Avengers film. We might even have had the second Avengers film, if I remember correctly. So we already had the ensembles. But I feel that Guardians of the Galaxy, and I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Kingsman, where you have really encapsulate magic and you strike gold. This is it. This is it for Marvel films. Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, I always say this when I'm talking to people or suggesting, especially if you're chatting, and you probably have this too if you're chatting to friends or family, and if you've been an avid fan of the MCU, and they say to you, I don't know if I want to watch all 457 films to catch up, but if I watch 1 or 2, or say if I watch 5, what would be the ones that I could get the gist of? For me, of course people would say, well, you need to watch the first Iron Man. I don't necessarily agree with that. To get the gist of that, you could just watch the first Avengers film, and if you enjoyed it more, you can go back around. But the quintessential Marvel film, I think when I look back, now of course the Infinity Saga's ended. Yes, Marvel films are still going, but when we think about just an enjoyable and kind of something that encapsulates everything that was fun about Marvel. Fun characters, enjoyable dialogue, great chemistry between the characters, funny moments, but also serious and emotional moments that are woven expertly well. I think Guardians of the Galaxy is the best example of a brilliant MCU film. And of course, yes, it got sequels. Yes, then the Guardians of the Galaxy got incorporated into things like Infinity War and Endgame, which of course I was glad of. But if I was just gonna, I still think this. I think if I was gonna fire on one Marvel movie to kind of recapture that time, because yes, you've got the other ones. You've got things like Thor Ragnarok. You've got things like Civil War, but they still kind of fall in the category of ensembles. Whereas Guardians of the Galaxy, yes, it is 5 characters. Yes, it is a group of, it is an ensemble, but it's in its own world. Essentially, it feels like its own thing. Yes, it is connected, of course, and blah blah blah. Yes, that is true. But I feel if you want to just enjoy one on its own, Guardians of the Galaxy, because it does it so well. And let's talk about a little bit about performances, and let's start with Chris Pratt. Now, Chris Pratt, like you, I probably only knew him with Parks and Rec. I didn't know he had a performance like this in him, and even from the start of this film, when he puts his headphones on and the iconic music plays, and we'll get to that a little bit when we talk about music and scores and soundtracks. But even from that first moment, Chris Pratt is it's like perfect casting. There's not many that you would apply that to in the last 15 years in any kind of movie franchise. There's only a few that I would say are better cast than Chris Pratt as Star-Lord. Because he has that vulnerability. He can't be a badass. He can't be a character that's infallible. He has to have his flaws. He has to actually be, the leader of the Guardians, but actually like the weakest. But there's something about him. It's so easy to root for him in this role. And the dynamic of the Guardians as a whole. Somebody like Dave Bautista, of course, who, was in the WWE, had made that transition to movies, and to kind of, because a lot of those WWE guys that make that transition, we've had John Cena recently, of course. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has been the kind of poster boy of making that transition from WWE to Hollywood, really. But Dave Bautista has definitely got the best acting career out of the bunch. To have the Guardians franchise, and of course he's included in things like Infinity War and Endgame. To have things like he's in the second Knives Out, he's in Blade Runner 2049. The career he's had, it's hard to dispute that yes, of course, The Rock makes the most money, but I don't think you'll be seeing too many of his appearances on on Five of the Best. Of course, that could change down the line, but just telling that right now. But for him to come into this and have such great comedic moments, people like Bradley Cooper and Vin Diesel just in essentially his voice roles, but especially Bradley Cooper, because Vin Diesel, he doesn't have too many lines, let's say, and that's being as obvious as I can make it. But Bradley Cooper as Rocket Raccoon. Now, if you'd have said that, of course this came out in 2014, if you'd have said in like 2012, when the MCU was kind of getting in a stride, that you're going to be one of your favourite characters of the MCU is going to be a tree and a raccoon, voiced by Bradley Cooper, I don't know that I would have believed you. But even basically from the credits roll of the first Guardians of the Galaxy, they're instantly 5 of the best characters in 5 of the best. That's the name of this series. But they are 5 of the best characters in all of MCU, and I would still stand by that. They're dynamic with each other. And of course Zoe Saldana, who might be one of the richest women in Hollywood now, because she is in Infinity War and Endgame, and they made a lot of money. And then she was in the 2 Avatar movies, and there's probably going to be in, however many more there is of that, and she's going to make a lot of money. But that doesn't mean that she's ever dropped the standard. And her kind of solemn and stoic nature, in contrast to Chris Pratt's comedic and charismatic, and having the two of them bounce off each other, it's just genius. Of course it's based in comic books, but to have this put to screen so well, and I suppose a big credit to that is to James Gunn. And of course James Gunn, before this had only had a little bit of, something like Slither, of course those Scooby-Doo movies he was involved in, but to take the Guardians of the Galaxy, to give, that was an inspired choice by Kevin Feige and Marvel as a whole, to give him the Guardians of the Galaxy, and basically you go mad with it. Because before this, we didn't really have too many films in the MCU, or Marvel as a whole, that went this wacky, that went this crazy, this kind of planet-hopping madness, and really enjoyable. They give him free rein. And I think it's so clear that the director's vision, along with the actors all very much being on board with what they're doing, it's just such an enjoyable experience. And the second one is great as well, and I have very much high hopes for the third one. That might be out by the time this video is out, so that might be on the channel. But when I just think about Guardians of the Galaxy 1, it always stands. Of course I love Infinity War and Endgame, we'll talk about them when we get there, but Guardians of the Galaxy 1 always stands out to me as one of my favourite Marvel films. Not just MCU, but just one of my favourite Marvel films. And I think it always will, no matter how strong the third film is, no matter what happens to the MCU in the long run. I think I'll always look back fondly on Guardians of the Galaxy.
Number 2.
Whiplash is directed by Damien Chazelle and stars Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons. Now, if you had went through the list so far and you kind of thought, it's 2014, I remember this film came out, where's he going to put Whiplash? You might have thought as this list is when it's going to be number 1. It was very close to being number 1. But number 1, when we get there, you'll probably understand why it is number 1. But this is one of those ones where the film in the number 2 slot on any other year would probably be number 1. or a lot of the other years, would be probably number one, because Whiplash is genuinely a fantastic film. A fantastically emotional experience, and let's not beat about the bush here. This is a film about drumming, and on the outset, I care nothing about drumming. I have to be honest. When someone said to me, there's a brilliant film called Whiplash, it has J. Jonah Jameson shouting at some young guy, but you'll love it. I went, right? Okay. Well, you know what? I'll take your word for it. I'll give it a go. And oh my god, am I glad I did. Because Whiplash is one of the most emotional, hard-hitting, and grounded films I think I've seen in recent memory. I say recent memory, it was nearly 10 years ago. But Whiplash really does have... There's so much subtlety, there's so much wonderful storytelling in Whiplash, because in our lead in Miles Teller, and of course J.K. Simmons got all the plaudits, and he is not only J. Jonah Jameson anymore. He is not that's not him being typecast. Him as Mr. Fletcher in this is one of the truly great villain performances in the last 15 years, I would say. And you know what's so good about his character? Before I get on to Miles Teller, the reason that J.K. Simmons is so good, because deep down, we've all had a teacher like this, or teachers like this, and you can tell why they do it. Now, of course, that's coming at it with adult eyes, and you probably have that scenario in school where there's been a teacher that's been overly harsh on you, and you can't fathom why they're picking on you. But the reality is, they want what's best for you. Now, I'm not sure that actually applies in every scenario, and certainly you could probably make the argument that it doesn't apply in Whiplash, but I think in this, it is in a selfish way. In the context of the film, it's a drummer that wants to be the best. But the teacher being so harsh is the reason, he has to be harsh to make him be the best. And if he's soft, and if he's, a soft touch and lets him away with not being perfect, well then they may as well all go home. And in that way, and I think so many people have said this, and I think I've said this a good few times on 5 of the Best, which is a villain story told right, and a villain story told well, is when their motivations are understandable to an extent. You may not agree with them. You may think they're a bit over the top, or, of course that varies depending on the villain or the antagonist to the protagonist. And in this scenario, the protagonist in Miles Teller. Now, Miles Teller, of course, now he's a bit more mainstream with things like Top Gun Maverick, who he's brilliant in. But him in Whiplash was a real shock to me. I didn't think he had a performance in him like this. And I've mentioned that a bit before, when I mentioned a few of the other films of this video. But I think, I had seen him prior to this in things like Project X in a smaller role. Things like 21 and Over. Did you ever see that film? Like that comedy film? For him to put in a, this film is jaw-dropping. And I think, of course, J.K. Simmons deserved his Best Supporting Actor award for this. But I felt that Miles Teller could have won Best Actor as well. But I know why what did win Best Actor did. But I do have to say that that's one that I always think it's one of the ones he'll feel a bit aggrieved to not have at least been in the in the question for that. Because Whiplash as a film overall, the dynamic between the protagonist and antagonist in this, it's gripping. It's a gripping film. There's not a part where you are not on the edge of your seat. And I know that sounds cliche because it's been used on every movie poster since, like, I don't know, 1970 or something. But I just feel like it is that, the tension in this film, there's more, and I know I've said this before, but it's a great comparison of how I felt, because there's more tension in this than a lot of horror films. Because in some horror films, you're tensing up because maybe a character's going to get killed or whatever the case may be. But in Whiplash, it's not the fear of dying, it's the fear of failure. And that's so brilliantly conveyed by the character. You can understand the pressure that he's under. You can feel the sweat on his brow as he's put through these trials and tribulations to become a wonderful musician. And again, I'm not someone that cares about performances in regards to, like, music performances or music instruments and all that. Yes, I admire the craft, absolutely, but it's not something that I've ever been truly engaged in. But I think if you narrow your mindset when it comes to movies or television shows or anything like that just to what you think you like and what you don't think you wouldn't like, because if I had done that, if I had went, you know what, don't really care too much for drumming, so I'm gonna miss that, I would have missed out on one of the truly best films of the last 10 to 15 years. Whiplash is amazing. And I want to mention, just before I finish talking about Whiplash, about Damien Chazelle, because Damien Chazelle has directed 3 films that I have seen now. He directed La La Land, he directed Whiplash, and he directed Babylon. And while they're varied on how much I adore them, because Whiplash I absolutely love, as you can hear me waxing lyrical about currently, La La Land I enjoy a lot, and may appear in future iterations of 5 of the Best. And again, a bit like what I was saying there, I'm not someone who adores musicals by any means. And then Babylon, again, a film that I didn't love from start to finish, but I loved a lot of what they did and a lot of the moments throughout it. Damien Chazelle is an awesome director, and he's became one of those directors that now, when I hear he's making a new film, that's one that's instantly on the anticipated list. And I suppose that's a credit to him for that. But what he's done in Whiplash, I don't know that he'll ever be able to have a film that I've loved as much as this. I love what Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons bring to their performances here. Every award this film got as it deserved. It probably should have got more, in truth. Whiplash is just amazing. And it is very unlucky to not be in the top spot. But the reason it's not in the top spot is because my number 1 is...
Number 1.
Interstellar. Is directed by Christopher Nolan and stars Matthew McConaughey, Anne Hathaway, Jessica Chastain, and Michael Caine. So you see why Whiplash was just edged out in the end? Because where do I start with Interstellar? Where do I start with Christopher Nolan as a whole? Because he is featured so prominently on this last kind of 5 to 10 episodes of 5 of the Best. He's been in number 1 spots, he's been in number 2 spots, he's been there or thereabouts for so long. And do you know what? Interstellar's his best film. Interstellar's the best, in my opinion. I think Interstellar's better than Inception and The Dark Knight. And that is such, like, don't think I'm going, because if you've been following the series, they had their own place, and I talked about how much I adore those films. But Interstellar it's one of those experiences that are very rare when it comes to cinema going and just movie watching, which is you fully feel like you've escaped for the 3 hours or whatever it is, that this film runs for. Because Interstellar, I love a good film that takes you on a journey, and that again is just in layman's terms, but a journey that you feel like the start of the film is a lifetime ago. You know what I mean? Like when I talked about one of my favourite films of all time, if not my favourite film of all time, which is Lord of the Rings: The Fellowship of the Ring, where we start, of course, bar the prologue, you start in the Shire, and by the time we've ended it on one hand, like, there is such a journey that's the characters have went on, and it feels like you've watched more than one movie because there's been so much has happened. There's never a point of wasted time, and I feel that Interstellar has a lot of that. I feel that Interstellar, from where they start and where they end, and the emotional, because that is such a word that, yes, it has the kind of sci-fi elements, and it's probably the most sci-fi-ish films that Christopher Nolan has directed to this date. Yes, I know there was Tenet, but I don't think that really applies. But for Interstellar, I just think there's so much that when Christopher Nolan sets out to direct these films, I wonder, does he know how much he hits on to a winner early? Because I imagine when you see the script of Interstellar, it's an interesting premise, and there's so many variables that you can either do right or do wrong. And yes, you could apply that to so many films, but I think with Interstellar in particular, there's so much that needs so much precision to be done accurately, to be done engagingly, and for this film, there's just so much of to do the amount of travelling that the characters do, the journey that Matthew McConaughey in particular goes on, to do that in the way they do, to keep it as engaging as it is for every moment of it. I don't think there's a moment of Interstellar, and again, it is quite a long movie, but there isn't a moment of disassociation with any of the characters. You're very much involved with the scenarios they're put in. You feel that word again I used earlier when I talked about Whiplash, which is tension. The tension and the severity and the necessity to succeed in this. It is so evident, and it's paced well. The story is written expertly. The dialogue is fantastic. Some of the emotional moments, even the meme moments, that one of McConaughey crying, and that's been edited so many times. But that actual moment in the film is heartbreaking. There's a lot of moments in this that are, they're tearjerkers. And the film as a whole is actually quite an emotional film. It's more about life and love and a father-daughter relationship at the heart of it. Never mind the actual mission that they're on. And someone like Anne Hathaway as well, who I enjoy, but I don't know that I've ever loved a performance of hers as much as I have with this. And for Matthew McConaughey, of course, he's done so much. This is his best. Matthew McConaughey as the lead in Interstellar is amazing. As is Jessica Chastain, as is Michael Caine, as is everyone else in this film. There's nobody here that isn't given 110% to their performances. It's one of those films that I remember writing this list, and I always knew it was going to be number one. And yes, I know that Whiplash pushed it close, because I absolutely love that film too. But when I talk about Interstellar, it was one I didn't even know where to start when I think about how much I love it. It's my favourite Christopher Nolan film, and those words alone, because everybody has their own, and I'm sure there might be the case that yours isn't Interstellar, and that's fair. It's something like Inception. The Dark Knight, I'm sure, is a lot of people's favourite, and you've heard me talk about it, so it's not like I don't love that film. And there's so many of Nolan's films that I just love. He's one of my favourite directors. He's definitely top 5, might even be top 3 directors working today. And instantly, and I mean, I'm probably overlapping on things I've said previously about him, so apologies for saying the same things, but it's true. I love his directorial styles. I love what he does, things like the cinematography in all of his films, and this is a comparison I say all the time. I've said it in so many videos, but it's so true. Some brilliant cinematography and some beautiful shots. They're like desktop wallpapers. They just look amazing. And there's some of the shots in Interstellar in particular that are so beautiful. Not that they're actually beautiful on screen, but it's maybe beautiful in a bleak way. Beautiful in a, wow, I can't believe they were able to achieve something like that on screen. There's so much about Interstellar that I love. And do you want to hear the most amazing part? I actually didn't get seeing this in cinema the first time round. I only got seeing Interstellar about 2 or 3 years after, because I had actually seen every other Nolan film in the cinema, but I hadn't seen Interstellar, and it was one I was like, how have I not got round to seeing that? Do you know what? I'll watch it some night. You know, and I was very nonchalant about it. I was just like, I'll watch it. I'll probably enjoy it. Probably won't enjoy it as much as the other ones. Once I finished this movie, I was a mess. I was an emotional mess. I just couldn't believe how much I loved it. And a bit like what I said earlier with Gone Girl, which is, you know, it's enjoyable to watch after a few years, because this came out obviously in 2014. I seen it for the first time in about 2015, 2016, and then I rewatched it again when we were all at home there, 2 or 3 years ago, when I went through and watched a lot of other movies. Some for the first time, some rewatches. And Interstellar, when I rewatched it, the appreciation I have for this film, the appreciation I have for Christopher Nolan as a director, the appreciation for the performances in this. Interstellar is one of those films that if you're looking for something to rewatch every few years and get nearly the same experience, the same rewarding experience that you did before, I would put Interstellar in my top 3 of all time that are for that. I don't know that you would love this film if you watched it every other month, but then that probably applies to so many films anyway. But because there's so much to unpack in this film, there's so much from Interstellar, from, you know, the first act, the second act, and third act, nearly all feel like different movies, bar the characters, because there's been so much of a journey. And this feels like a journey, and it's a brilliant one. Interstellar is nothing short of a masterpiece, in my opinion. I think it's just fantastic. It's just so good. So good. You know, I could try and break down any of the other stuff that, you know, that's good, but the reality is I just adore this film. I adore Interstellar. And again, to have it be at the top of my list for Nolan films, I mean, that says it all. You know, because Christopher Nolan has had so many fantastic movies. And to have this as the peak of them, the top of the mountain, Interstellar is so wonderful, and it's so deservedly my favourite film of the year 2014. So there we have it, the year 2014, and to be honest with you guys, that has been, for the longest time, I always put 2014 as my top 2 favourite movie years. It's always up there with another one, and it's coming in a few years' time, a few videos' time. But 2014 is just, I mean, that list of honourable mentions, any of them could have been on, you know, a top 5 of another year. Because let's go through some that were very unlucky not to make it into that top spot, or that top 5. Things like American Sniper, one of Bradley Cooper's best, if not his best. Edge of Tomorrow, one of my favourite Tom Cruise, definitely one of my favourite Emily Blunt performances. Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is probably the most unlucky film to not be in a top 5. And I mean that because I love that movie. Jake Gyllenhaal is unbelievable in that movie. And for that not to be in here, and that was one that, like, I was so tempted to bump one of the other films out, but I just couldn't. I knew my top 5 for this year. I actually knew it way before I even started 5 of the best. I remember thinking, what are my favourite films of this year? And it was always that 5. Interstellar first, Whiplash second, Guardians third, Gone Girl fourth, Kingsman 5. But, I mean, if we're going 6 and 7, 6 is Nightcrawler, 7 is Ex Machina, 8 is Theory of Everything. Because those films are just... if I did a 10 of the best, doesn't have the same ring to it, they'd be in there, you know. But that's by the by. But they're the honourable mentions that were very close. Some of the honourable mentions closer than others, as I say. But 24, I can't even speak. Just love it. Just love 2014. It's a year that has such a memorable impact to me for so many movies. And a wee mention to John Wick, the start of a truly great action franchise. And why the first film, if you've been on the channel for a while, you'll know I've said this a good lot of times, the first film I actually find the weakest, but it's still one of the greater action movies of this time. John Wick, again, could have been in here if it was another year, but I'm sure the other ones will appear as we go on, as we go down the years. But yeah, 2014 is an awesome year. I always have it in my head, as I say, that it's always right up there, and it probably always will be. Of course I want to be proved wrong. Of course I want, in the 2020s here, or even further, I want there to be a year where there is as many films that I just think of so much quality. And when you're struggling to get 5, when you feel like you're annoyed that there's ones that should be on the 5 but they can't be fit in, that's when you know it's a really good year. 2014 is simply the best year we've had on 5 of the Best so far. There has been good years before, and most of them, and to be honest, when we talk about every year of film, there is so much quality. There is, and I know you probably get sick of me going, oh, well, this has been a great year. But there isn't, I don't think there's been a year of film, possibly 2020, just for obvious reasons. But you can't, I don't know. I just always think there's so much quality to be found in movies each year. But 2014 stands above so many, and nearly all of them, to me. Because there's so much to love, so many amazing movies, so many amazing performances, so many films that something like Whiplash, as I say, like that would be a number 1 on basically every. I actually, bar maybe 4 or 5 episodes we've done so far, I think Whiplash would have been number 1 on all those other ones. So that just shows how much I love Interstellar. So yeah, that has been my 5 of the best of the year 2014. A brilliant year. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, leave a like, let me know. You want to stick around, subscribe for more of these. There's other videos on the channel. I'd love you to stick around. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys.
Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.